Take out a map of South America. Look at it for a moment. Now find Chile, and just stare at it. Because something is wrong. Something is deeply, almost comically, impossibly wrong with this country. Chile is a country that should not exist. Not because of its politics, not because of its people, but because of its shape. Chile is 2,700 miles long. That is the distance from New York City to Los Angeles and back again. That is the distance from London to Tehran. That is longer than the entire continent of Australia from east to west. And at its widest point, Chile is 110 miles across. 110 miles. You could drive across Chile in 2 hours. Chile is, by every reasonable measurement, the longest and narrowest country on the face of the earth. A sliver, a ribbon, a scratch on the western edge of South America, squeezed between the highest mountain range on one side and the coldest ocean on the other. And the question that every person who has ever looked at a map eventually asks is the same question. Why? Why does Chile look like that? How did this happen? Who decided that a country shaped like a noodle was a good idea? The answer is one of the most fascinating stories in the history of geography, conquest, and sheer human stubbornness that you have ever heard. This is the story of why Chile is the way it is. To understand Chile's impossible shape, you first have to understand the geography that created it. Look at the western edge of South America. On one side, running the entire length of the continent like a spine of stone, is the Andes mountain range, the highest, longest, most brutal mountain chain in the Western Hemisphere. Peaks that reach 22,000 feet above sea level, passes blocked by snow for months at a time, a wall of rock and ice that runs without interruption from Venezuela all the way to Patagonia. On the other side, the Pacific Ocean, cold, deep, relentless, the Humboldt Current pushing up from Antarctica, keeping the water temperature low and the coastline harsh even in places that sit at the same latitude as tropical beaches on the other side of the world. And between these two walls, a narrow strip. That strip is Chile. And here is the thing that most people don't realize. That strip is not one place. It is not one climate. It is not one landscape. Because Chile runs so far north to south, it passes through virtually every climate zone on Earth. In the north, Chile contains the Atacama Desert, the driest planet on the entire planet. There are weather stations in the Atacama that have never, in recorded history, measured a single drop of rain. Never, not once. The soil in some parts of the Atacama is so dry, so completely devoid of moisture and organic material, that NASA uses it to test equipment designed for the surface of Mars. Travel south through Chile and the climate shifts. Forests appear, rain falls, vineyards and farms spread across fertile valleys that look like something from the south of France. Keep going south and you enter the Lake District. Volcanoes, ancient araucaria trees that have been standing since before the Roman Empire fell, green valleys and clear rivers, and a landscape of such extraordinary beauty that it stops people in their tracks. Go further still and you reach Patagonia, wind so powerful it can knock a person off their feet, glaciers the size of cities, the Torres del Paine, granite towers rising out of the earth like the fingers of a buried giant, one of the wildest, most untouched places left on this planet. And finally, at the very bottom, Chilean territory reaches all the way to Cape Horn, the southernmost point of the Americas, the place where the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans crash into each other in a permanent state of fury, a place so dangerous that sailors gave it a name that carried the weight of genuine terror. One country, every climate on Earth, a desert where it never rains, a glacier where it never stops snowing, and everything imaginable in between. But none of this answers the real question. Why is Chile shaped this way politically? Why did the borders end up here? For that, you have to go back 500 years, to a Spanish soldier who didn't know when to stop walking. In 1540, a Spanish conquistador named Pedro de Valdivia was given a mission. The Spanish Empire controlled enormous portions of South America. They had conquered the Aztec Empire in Mexico. They had destroyed the Inca Empire in Peru. They had gold and silver flowing back to Spain in quantities that were reshaping the entire global economy. But the land to the south, beyond the Inca territories, beyond the desert, beyond the mountains, was unknown. Valdivia looked south and decided to find out what was there. He crossed the Atacama Desert with a small army of Spanish soldiers and indigenous allies. The crossing nearly killed them. The Atacama is not simply dry, it is hostile in a way that is almost personal. Heat during the day, freezing temperatures at night, and nothing, absolutely nothing that a human body needs to survive. They made it through, and on the other side, Valdivia found a valley, green and fertile, with a river running through it and mountains visible on both sides. In 1541, he founded a city there and named it Santiago. And then, instead of stopping, he kept going, because Pedro de Valdivia was a man with a very specific problem. He did not understand the word enough. He pushed south, he founded more cities, he sent reports back to the Spanish crown describing a land of enormous potential, a land worth controlling, a land worth dying for. And then he met the Mapuche. The Mapuche people had lived in the territory south of the Atacama for thousands of years. They were not like the Aztec or the Inca. They did not build vast stone cities. They did not have a centralized empire with a single ruler who could be captured or killed, and whose collapse would bring the whole civilization down. The Mapuche were decentralized, fiercely independent, and absolutely unwilling to submit to anyone. When the Spanish arrived, the Mapuche did something that almost no indigenous people in the Americas managed to do. They fought back, and they kept fighting. For over 300 years, the Mapuche resisted Spanish conquest. 300 years, the longest and most sustained indigenous resistance in the history of the Americas. They adopted Spanish military tactics, they learned to ride horses, they studied how the Spanish fought, and they adapted. Every time the Spanish pushed south, the Mapuche pushed back. The Spanish eventually drew a line, a border. The Biobío River, roughly 300 miles south of Santiago. South of that line, they said, is Mapuche territory. We are not going further. This was not generosity, this was defeat. For the first time in their history of conquest in the Americas, the Spanish Empire had been stopped. And this border, this line drawn by the reality of Mapuche resistance, became one of the forces that shaped the eventual borders of Chile. The Spanish colony grew long and thin because the mountains blocked expansion to the east, the ocean blocked expansion to the west, the desert blocked expansion to the north, and the Mapuche blocked expansion to the south. Chile was squeezed into its shape by geography on 3 sides and by human courage on the 4th. When Chile declared independence from Spain in 1818, the new nation inherited borders that were, in some places, deeply uncertain. To the east, the Andes were a natural dividing line between Chile and the territory that would become Argentina. But the Andes are not a single clean line on a map. They are a complicated tangle of peaks and valleys and rivers, and in many places exactly where the border should be was not clear at all. To the north, the situation was even more complicated. The Atacama Desert, which would later prove to be extraordinarily valuable, was not clearly Chilean or Peruvian or Bolivian. It was simply a desert, empty and unclaimed, which in the language of the 19th century meant available. For a few decades, this ambiguity simmered quietly. And then someone found something in the desert. Saltpeter, sodium nitrate, a mineral that in the 19th century was more valuable than gold. Saltpeter was used to make fertilizer at a time when global agriculture was desperately trying to feed a rapidly growing population. It was used to make explosives at a time when wars were being fought across every continent. The Atacama Desert, that lifeless, waterless, utterly inhospitable wasteland, was sitting on top of the largest deposits of sodium nitrate in the world. Suddenly, everyone wanted it. Bolivia had territory in the desert. Peru had territory in the desert. Chile had territory in the desert. And in 1879, the argument over who owned the saltpeter became a war. The War of the Pacific, one of the most consequential and least remembered conflicts in the history of the Americas. Chile went to war against Bolivia and Peru simultaneously. On paper, this should have been impossible. Chile was smaller, Chile was outnumbered, Chile was fighting on two fronts against two nations that had signed a mutual defense treaty specifically designed to counter Chilean power. But Chile had something its enemies did not: a functioning state, a professional military, a navy that was well-equipped and well-trained, and a population that, for reasons rooted in its particular colonial and geographic history, had developed a culture of discipline and cohesion that its larger neighbors lacked. The war lasted 4 years, and Chile won. Not narrowly, not barely. Chile won comprehensively, dramatically, and in a way that permanently altered the map of South America. Bolivia lost its entire coastline. Every mile of Pacific Ocean access that Bolivia had ever possessed was transferred to Chile. Bolivia became a landlocked nation, a status it has never recovered from and has never stopped grieving over. To this day, Bolivia maintains a navy with no ocean to sail on. A navy that exists on a high-altitude lake in the middle of the Andes, training for a war that ended 140 years ago, and for an ocean it has not touched since. Peru lost its southernmost territories, including the city of Arica, which became Chilean, and Chile gained the northern desert, the saltpeter, and an extra few hundred miles of length added to its already extraordinary shape. The longest country in the world got even longer because of a war over a mineral in a desert. Chile's shape has consequences that go far beyond geography. In a country 2,700 miles long, the capital city of Santiago sits roughly in the middle, and from Santiago the country stretches 1,000 miles north into one of the driest places on Earth, and 1,700 miles south into one of the wildest and most remote places on Earth. Governing a country of this shape is genuinely, practically difficult. A storm in Patagonia might as well be happening on another planet from the perspective of a government official in Santiago. The northern mining towns are so distant from the capital that for much of Chilean history they developed their own cultures, their own economies, their own political identities. The people of Arica, in the far north, live closer to the capitals of Peru and Bolivia than to their own capital. The people of Punta Arenas, in the far south, are closer to Antarctica than to Santiago. Chile is not simply a long, thin country. Chile is a country that contains multitudes, multiple climates, multiple ecosystems, multiple cultures, all strung together along that extraordinary, improbable western edge of a continent. And yet, somehow, it works. Somehow the people of the Atacama and the people of Patagonia and the people of the Lake District and the people of Santiago all consider themselves Chilean. They share a language, a history, a flag, and a particular way of looking at the world that is distinctly, unmistakably their own. There is one more part of this story that almost nobody outside Chile knows about. Chile claims territory in Antarctica. a wedge-shaped slice of the frozen continent, stretching from 53 degrees west to 90 degrees west, reaching all the way to the South Pole. Chile has maintained a permanent presence in Antarctica since 1947. There is a Chilean town there, a real town, with a school and a post office and a church. Children have been born in Chilean Antarctica. Couples have been married there. If you include the Antarctic claim, Chile's territory extends from the driest desert on Earth to the South Pole itself. From a place where it has never rained to a place that is covered in ice 2 miles thick. No other country on Earth spans that range of extremes. Chile is, in every possible sense, a country of the impossible. A country that should not exist, a country squeezed into shape by mountains and ocean and desert, and the extraordinary resistance of a people who refuse to be conquered. A country stretched beyond reason by the accidents of colonial history and the violence of a war over a mineral. A country that, if you look at it on a map, still makes you stop and stare and ask the same question that everyone eventually asks. Why? Now you know.